Hi guys, so now we are back with the next part of NNT implementation in Cisco iOS. Now I'll continue with configuring port address translation and configuring static NAT. So to configure a port address translation, okay, port address translation is actually um, similar to dynamic NAT, okay, but the difference between dynamic NAT and port address translation or PAT is um, in part, a single public IP address is used for all internal private IP address. So, but during the translation, different port will be assigned to each private IP address. So, part is also known as NAT overload. So you can see the difference in dynamic NAT. You have a range, a pool of public IP address, but in part you only have a single public IP address. So this is the typical form of NAT used in today's network and supported by most router. So what happened here is part will works by creating dynamic NAT mapping. So basically the um, the router keeps a NAT table entry for every unique combination of private IP address and port. Okay, so now usually the public address assigned to the internal network is the IP address or public IP address of the interface. So here, so we will assign the IP address of the interface to the internal network. Okay, but when you are using the command overload, so basically different port will be assigned to each private IP address. Okay, so now you do not need to create a pool, okay, because only a single public IP address is used. And the rest of the implementation is similar to NAT, meaning you need to specify what are the internet address to be permitted, okay, through the translation, and then we map the ACL and the public IP address on the interface that facing the outside network. And finally, we need to configure the NAT interface, determine which one is NAT inside and which one is the NAT outside. Okay, so without further ado, so I'll continue with the configuration. So notice that the configuration now is on R3. Okay, the configuration now is on R3. Okay, so config T, and then the first thing we need to do is we need to create access list to permit the internet network. So the internet network here is 172.16.1.0 and the wildcard mask is 0.0.0.127. Oh, I forgot to permit the network. Sorry. Next thing we need to do is we need to map the access list to source list 1 and map it into the interface. So the interface is S001. So basically the IP address of S001 is 200.200.200.18. So this is the public IP address that will be used for the translation. But we need to put overload because otherwise we won't the router won't assign or translate the public IP address according to the port. Okay. And then the next step is we need to go to the interface as G0.10, and we define it as IP NAT inside. And then we need to go to interface S001, define it as IP NAT outside. So I'm not going to test it yet. I will continue with the static NAT and I will test it together with static NAT. So on static NAT is very simple. Okay, when we actually using static NAT implementation. So we need to understand that with static NAT, okay, so go to static NAT. So with static NAT, usually is used if we are going to give or provide translation for a single host. Okay, so meaning we want to translate one private IP address to a single public IP address. Usually we will implement it for a server because we know that the traffic request for the servers is higher than the other hosts in the network. So basically, in static NAT, each private IP address will be mapped to a single public IP address. So we do not usually use or not often use static NAT because it requires one public IP address for each of the private IP address. So in this case, the configuration is very simple. Okay, I can't seem to find the pointer here, but it's okay. So the configuration is very simple. So basically IP NAT inside. So source static. Okay, if it is a dynamic or part, so source is the least, but because we only want to map one-to-one mapping, so it should be static. And then this is the IP address of the server 192.168.1.142, and this is the public IP address that we will assign to the server. And then don't forget to configure the NAT interface. So let us do the configuration now, and we're going back to R1. Okay, so on R1, so the command is ipnat inside source static. The IP address of the server is 192.168.1.142, and then we will map it to a public IP address 200.200.200.3. Make sure the IP address is available IP address, meaning it's not being used by other devices or any router interface. Okay, that's it. And then we go to interface G0, 0.20 for VLAN 20, IP NAT inside. Okay, I'm not going to configure for the serial interface because we already did that earlier on for dynamic NAT. So let us try to test. Okay, on PC2, okay, PC2 here, we have already configured the path, right? And now on R1, okay, we configured the static NAT. So now we are going to test it together. So I'm going to ping 200.200.200.3. So you can see that I am pinging the public IP address instead of pinging the private IP address. So if the translation works, so meaning you can get a reply. So we get a reply, meaning the translation is okay. So on both sides, okay, on both sides, R3 and R1, so we need, we'll see the, we'll see the translation to show IPNAT trans, oh, shit, IPNAT translation. Okay, so there is a translation there. I'm not quite I'm not quite sure where I'm supposed to. Okay, I think it's here. Okay. So we go to here, show IPNAT translation. Oh, it's not there. So maybe I need to ping again. Try to ping again. I think I messed up with the oh, okay, because I reconnected the cable just now. So show IP network station. Okay. So let us compare side by side. Okay, this is the translation table for R1, and this is the translation table for R3. So for R1, you can see that first of all, R1 we configure static, right? Static for server 192.168.1.142, because it's a static translation. So first of all, you will find a permanent entry, permanent translation. Even when there is no traffic at all being exchanged in the network, this one will remain in the NAT translation table. So 192.6 server 192.168.1.142 will always being statically translated or mapped into 200.200.200.3. And then when in network 172 earlier on, we ping the 200.200.200.3, you can see that the destination, right? So the destination is 200.3. So you can see that this is destination. But what I want to show in R3 is the translation of port at the translation. So the private IP address 172.16.1.51 will be assigned to interface S0/0/1's IP address, which is 200.200.200.18. But notice for each of the replies transition, it will be given different port numbers. So in this case, 13, 14, 15, and 16. So that's how the translation happen in a part or port address translation. And going back to R1, where static NAT is being used, you can see that clearly there is a translation here from server address 192.168.1.142 to 200.200.200.3. So basically, both part and static NAT verification is successful. Let me use show IP NAT statistic to see where, which is another way to see whether there is a translation NAT for static. So we can see that there's one translation using static translation here. Okay. So this is okay, this one is for dynamic mapping. So we are not going to look at this. Hence the reason why no allocated IP address, public IP address is given for the dynamic mapping, because just now we are using the static NAT. So let me see what happened in this part, R3. Okay, I think we just miss it because the time has expired for the entries in the translation table, because part is port address translation, or part is part of dynamic translation, which only have temporary entries in the translation table. Okay guys, so I hope you guys can understand this lesson. So I'll see you guys next week with standard and extended ACL. Assalamualaikum and good morning.